Welcome to History Now. I'm very delighted to welcome Brian Dooley here today. He's an author and human rights activist, and he's here to talk about his book, Choosing the Green, Second Generation Irish and the Cause of Ireland. Brian, thanks for coming in. Just to begin with, I would talk about your book, Choosing the Green, about second generation Irish and the cause of Ireland. Mm-hmm. You open up your book talking about struggles with identity and Irish identity, because coming from your background, you're second generation Irish, born in London. Mm-hmm. This idea of an Irish identity, can you tell us, how you approached that?
It was more difficult in those days, I think, for kids like me, teenagers like me, to explore or claim and realise an Irish identity than it is now, right? Because during the 70s, 80s, 90s, I mean, the IRA was bombing London pretty regularly, and so as soon as you were in a conversation about, oh, I'm Irish, then almost immediately, do you condemn what's happening? Do you apologise for this? Are you on the side of and now, thankfully, that's all faded away, and now those conversations are much more likely to be given in the context of sport. In the World Cup, who do you support? Or in rugby, do you support England or Ireland? Or even in cricket now, right? Although, in the last few months, actually, there's a little frisson back I see about people claiming an Irish passport because of Brexit. And there's a little edge there of, are you really Irish, or is this just convenient for you? But back in I was a teenager, the late 70s, early 80s, it had a far harder edge there. British people, not all of them, but, sort of puzzled, why would you claim loyalty to that? Why have you got an Irish passport when you could have a British one? I mean, a general bemusement about that. And then often what does this mean? What is this saying about yourself? And actually, for me and other kids like me, I'm not sure what it was we were saying about ourselves. There are other ways to express our identity, to our Irish identity. We went to old-fashioned Irish dance halls in London, I mean, oddly, given that punk really literally was born and was growing about a mile from where I grew up, completely over my head, right? What we thought was more rebellious was to be going and see show bands, at the big Galtymore in North London, right? I played GAA in London for Clan na Gael. I played for London at GAA. The girls did dancing sometimes. So there were various ways of expressing your Irishness, but there was no getting away from the troubles. I mean, we weren't living it the way, obviously, that people here were living it, but it was never far away.
Did any of that sort of struggles with identity, communal identity, lead you to writing that book?
I guess. I mean, it wasn't like, I've got this point to prove, but having, I suppose, remembered, all these incidents that would be stored away in the back of your brain there. Oh, this important Irish historical figure, whether it's cultural or political or Republican, was second generation Irish, and that's not really spoken about or known. So, I mean, I didn't intend it to be, and I hope the book isn't like a list of all these, second generation important figures, but some people who really shaped Irish history. I mean, from Thomas Clarke to De Valera to Countess Markievicz to James Connolly. These are second generation figures, and for one reason or another, and I have theories about this, but one reason or another, either that's glossed over, and sometimes, especially in the old days, people will pretend that these people were actually born in Ireland when they weren't, or there isn't really a sense of a contribution to Irish history, I think particularly to republicanism, made by second generation. And the second generation, we have this pejorative name of plastic paddies, right? And I mean, it's not like the most hurtful thing in the world, but some key Irish historical figures were quote unquote plastic paddies.
Yeah, well, that's true. And I was in Dublin the other day, and on the anniversary of the lockout, actually. So
Jim
right
Larkin.
In the middle of the city centre, you have a statue of Jim Larkin.
Right.
Yeah, and round the corner you've got Connolly as well.
Mm-hmm.
So those people, I think are Connolly more so. There's an awareness that he was born in Edinburgh, and things like that there.
Yeah.
But the likes of Tom Clarke, you mentioned.
When I began researching the book, I mean, I discovered all sorts of things which I hadn't known before. one of which was the strength of the second generation and third generation, but really second generation presence in the 1916 rising, particularly in the GPO, particularly the first day of the GPO. So in the years leading up to 1916, Irish volunteers had been organising drilling in the major cities in England and Scotland. Michael Collins, in fact, was a key player in that. He lived most of his adult life in London. Now, he doesn't count as a plastic paddy because he was born and brought up in Cork, right? But the guys he was drilling with and organising and his fellow volunteers in London, many of those were born and brought up in London and sounded like me. Dozens and dozens of those guys and women went to Dublin before the rising, some bringing ammunition, some just preparing for something that was going to happen. And they set themselves up in a camp in the south of Dublin. And so the morning of the rising, it was that garrison from Kimmage who were first into the GPO, led by Thomas Clark, who had been born in England, I think until he was around 10, grew up in South Africa. And they burst in, and the first occupation of the GPO had a heavy presence of Scouse and Cockney and Glaswegian accents. I mean, I would estimate, it's hard to know exactly the numbers, but I would say half, maybe more than half of those first guys who rushed in didn't have Irish accents. And again, this isn't the most important note in Irish history, but it's really not acknowledged anywhere. You see actually some fabulous books around the GPO, a style called Henry by Roddy Doyle, meticulously researched. And the RTE have done various dramas over the years about what happens day to day, and everyone except Connolly speaks with an Irish accent, and that just wasn't true.
So of these people, and I really found it really interesting what you were talking about in your book, like Dublin was awash with these Scouse and Glaswegian accents and all, it was like, but there are a couple of people, that the majority of people aren't going to be familiar with, and like Johnny O'Connor, Margaret Skinner.
Sure.
Could you tell us maybe about those people?
So Margaret Skinner was from Scotland. She had in fact come to Dublin a few months before the rising, around Christmas time, literally wearing a load of explosives. And she was part of the Irish Citizen Army, and in fact she fought and was wounded at Stephen's Green, fighting with Constance Markovic, another second generation Irish person. Skinner actually was running an errand to the GPO as Pearse stood out on the pavement and proclaimed the Republic. And in around there, in the GPO, as I say, that first day, as the days went on, they were reinforced by more local volunteers. But Skinner was there at the GPO, and then she fought at Stephen's Green. There were other second generation Irish guys in the GPO, notably Desmond Fitzgerald. And then other guys who never, eventually became super important, but they were nonetheless there as volunteers. There's a guy called Johnny O'Connor, and because he had such a thick Cockney accent, he was inevitably called Blimey O'Connor. And he was an electrician, and along with another fellow from London, Liam Daly, he was sent across O'Connell Street by Connolly, opposite the GPO, to try and set up a sort of a telegraph, like a radio signal, to proclaim the Republic to the world. So these two guys run across O'Connell Street, bang on the door where other volunteers have occupied the building, and there's this sort of standoff where they're shouting, let us in, we want to set, Connolly has sent us, and the Irish guys inside are like, there's these Cockneys outside, let's open the door and shoot them, right? So eventually that gets settled out, but it was just a confusing mix, I guess. What really mattered was when it came to a discussion around surrender, because it was actually different, legally different for the guys who had been born and brought up in Britain than the native Irish guys, because the guys who the second generation guys were liable to conscription into the British Army and could be prosecuted and jailed or press ganged into the British Army. So when the discussion came after the week of occupation to give up, those second generation guys were really the last to agree to it. I mean, not because they were particularly more courageous or had greater faith, but because the price they thought for them would be greater. And they were right. I mean, the leaders obviously were executed. I mean, 2 of those, second generation, Connolly and Clark. But then when the bulk of the other volunteers were sent to the prison camp in Ffranggoch in Wales, they had to organise themselves in this no names, no numbers campaign where they refused to cooperate with the authorities to say who they were, because the authorities were trying to figure out which of these guys were English. And about half a dozen of them were eventually caught and so sent to prison while the Irish-born volunteers were freed. And so they were forced into the British Army. When they refused to do that, then they spent time in prison. So that was like a legal difference really between the two, yeah.
We tend to sort of think of, the Easter Rising as this very straight down the middle, Irish versus British, but we all know there's, Irish people on the side of the British soldiers British as well. Yeah. But when things get a bit more sort of, more complicated, when you get the War of Independence, there's quite a number of them there as well. Desmond Fitzgerald, you mentioned, but there's others. Erskine Childers, Pierce Beasley. You had a guy who's written a fabulous autobiography, Joe Good. And these guys play a part in the War for Independence, and also then the IRA recruits fairly successfully in England and Scotland during that time for the IRA to be active in England and Scotland during the War of Independence. So mostly what the activities were arson. There was a lot of gun running. I think that's the most valuable contribution. There was a recent book out by Gerard Noonan cataloguing this. There was a guy called John Pinkman from Liverpool who joined the Irish Volunteers in Liverpool. And he took part in some of these activities and written a great account of that too. So mostly they did the gun running, the arson. There were some reprisals against black and tan homes in England, and they also helped with some prison breaks in England. About 1,000. I mean, again, the numbers, it's not like they were official lists, and if they were secret or destroyed. But the estimates are around 1,000 active, again, not necessarily full-time, IRA volunteers in England and Scotland in 1920 or so. Yeah, I remember De Valera many years later, paid tribute to people in Scotland, Glasgow, on that. One person in particular from Scotland, John McPeak.
John McPeak.
John McPeak.
Yeah.
Was with Collins in his, last day.
In his last day, and I really don't want to get into the conspiracy theories about who might have killed Collins or who might not have, but he's up there as a contender because, first of all, there may be something slightly suspect about second generation Irishman, right? And in fact, he defects a few months after Collins' assassination. He's guarding Collins at the time that Collins is assassinated. And a few months afterwards, though, McPeak defects to the anti-treaty side. And so this is also given as evidence that he was secretly always a spy and perhaps either facilitated or even actually killed Collins. Yeah.
Is there any sense among the second generation Irish when the treaty split happens, what side they're going to take? And
what happens, of course, is they fall either side of it. Although, and I don't want to suggest that there's a psychological explanation for this at all, but the leading second generation figures, by and large, fall on the anti-treaty side. Obviously De Valera, right? But then you have Markovic, you have Erskine Childers too, and they are hardline, right? Although Desmond Fitzgerald, for instance, falls on the Collins side of it too. But yeah, when the treaty happens, you find the second generation Republicans fall in either side. For instance, Pinkman, the guy from Liverpool, is part of the Free State Army, which attacks and kills Cathal Brewer. Now, with Cathal Brewer, who is injured but not killed, is a guy called Louis Noble, who is also a second generation volunteer. So he's fighting on the anti-treaty side, and Pinkman fighting on the Free State side, involved in the same skirmish, and Noble gets injured and Cathal Brewer gets killed. Yeah.
If we just rewind a couple of years to the War of Independence again.
Yeah.
A very famous scene in the Michael Collins movie,
Right.
where he's in Pier Street. Is it Pier Street?
Brunswick Street.
Yeah. And Stephen Ray's character, Ned Broy, is showing him all the files.
Yeah.
Didn't go down like that in real life, though, did it?
Well, it half went down like that, right? So it's true that Collins managed to sneak himself into the Brunswick Street police headquarters to look at the intelligence files that the police had on the movement, on Irish republicanism. But in the film, he's on his own. In reality, he was with Sean Noonan, a young guy from Brixton, right? But there's no place for Noonan in the film. Now, whether that's just sort of too confusing, why is Collins with this guy who sounds English? I don't know. But again, it's just another example of that second generation contribution not really being airbrushed out of history. I mean, I don't think there's anything sinister about it, but just left out of history by negligence. And I think partly this is because the way that history is, Irish Republican history is told and passed on, is actually at a very local level. I mean, Irish American Tip O'Neill says all politics is local. I think to some degree all history is local too, right? So you get, in the decades after the War of Independence, you get local heroes emerging with a very, very much a local identity. So the local newspapers in the 40s and 50s were producing books like this, Kerry's fighting story, right? There was another Cork's fighting story. And across the country, you get this celebration, or at least this memorialisation of the local contribution. Now, there isn't an equivalent for that in England or Scotland, right? And this runs right through the century. So if you think about even the 1950s IRA campaign, right? And two guys are killed in the same attack on a barracks in Fermanagh, Fergal O'Hanlon and Sean South. And the way that those stories are told in popular culture is very much emphasised about where they're from, right? So Fergal O'Hanlon, right, you get, my name is O'Hanlon and I just turned 16. My home is in Monaghan, that's where I was weaned. Right, so essential that we know about O'Hanlon, right? How old he is, what his name is, and where he's from. Killed with O'Hanlon that night is Sean South, right? And if people think they know one thing about Sean South, it's where he's from, right? And the leader was a Limerick man, Sean South from Garryon. Sean South not just gets a county, but even the suburb of a city that he's supposedly from. Now, it turns out fabulously, he's not actually from Garryon at all, but he is given the identity, a local identity. And the second generation guys just don't get that, right? There is no local keeper of the flame in their history. My mum is from Dingle, right? And the local library in Dingle for, as long as I can, 50 years, is a shrine to Thomas Ashe, who died on hunger strike in 1917, right? You go up the steps to the library and there's this memorial to him, his comb, his hat, this tiny piece of bread they tried to force feed him. And up and down Ireland, the history, and particularly the history of republicanism, I think, is memorialised at a very parish level. You get crosses in villages. These are the men and women who died for Ireland, right? If you walk along the Falls Road, it's a neighbourhood, right? There's a commemorative gardens, the memorials. Here are the Republicans from Clonard or from Divis. So when we think of a picture of a national Irish history of rebellion, really it's a tapestry of thousands of local acts of resistance. And nobody is ever going to put up a monument to the IRA Volunteers from Glasgow or London. English Heritage are never going to put up a blue plaque, right, at the Noonan's house saying, here's to acknowledge their years of service to the IRA, right? That's just not going to happen. So I think that's part of the reason that Sean Noonan, there's been nobody arguing for him and his history locally, whereas across Ireland for the local heroes, that's that's very strong.
Yeah. Well, moving on to sort of post-war, post-Second World War,
Yeah.
there's a person who features very heavily in your book, who seems a bit like out of place in that sort of sense, you know, that you're talking about earlier, Sean McStephon. He was in the RAF.
He was in the RAF, yeah.
So someone who features very heavily in the Troubles. Could you give us a bit of background on his upbringing and, you know, where he features in the story?
So McStephon was born and brought up in North London. His mother, he says, was from Belfast, although he wasn't sure what her politics were in Belfast. He knew very little actually really about her. I knew him towards the end of his life, and I asked him a lot about this, and he didn't really know much about his mum. And she died when he was quite young. So he grew up with a very English father, Tory voting father. And somewhere in his teenage years, or towards the end of his teenage years, he began to claim or realise an Irish identity. And so when he was discharged from the army, from the Air Force, he was already starting to associate himself, I guess, with Irishness. And in fact, in 1949, he had organised an IRA unit in London. And he wrote to Dublin for sort of official affiliation, which was granted. And so Sean McStephon, he'd been born and brought up until that time as John Stevenson, made his first trip to Ireland in 1950, a year after he'd already been in the IRA. And again, when I asked him about this, you know, wasn't that odd? He said, not that odd. And he then claimed a sort of a lineage back to those guys from 1916 who had been born and brought up in London or Sheffield or Glasgow or whatever. And their first time in Ireland, after years of being Irish volunteers, was to take part in the Easter Rising. But yeah, McStephon was always a sort of an outsider, a bit of an oddity. In some ways, like his predecessor as IRA Chief of Staff in the 30s, Sean McBride, another second-generation prominent Republican, who never quite fit with the other IRA colleagues. McBride had been born and brought up in Paris, although his father had been executed as one of those. So he had, certainly a Republican lineage through his father and his mother, Maud Gonne. Whereas McStephon sort of came out of nowhere, really. McStephon then was arrested and sentenced for gun running in the 50s, spent most of the 1950s in prison in England. And then in the 60s, when the IRA begins to divide between a sort of an international revolutionary left and those who prioritise trying to defend Catholic areas in the north, McStephon becomes really the strongest voice in the IRA to try to get away from this, as he saw it, non-military international leftist revolutionary talk and do what he saw as core, defend your own people, meaning Catholics in the north. And so when the split comes in the IRA, it's McStephon who leads it, and he sets up and is the first Chief of Staff of the Provisional IRA. I mean, it's odd, right? He doesn't have this local constituency pushing him. He's not like from Derry or from Ardoyne or somewhere where, he has a local political backing. I mean, he's nominally from the IRA in Cork, but really he's a Londoner. So McStephon then is Chief of Staff of the IRA Provisional and is eased out fairly quickly. He's arrested, goes to prison. He's eased out fairly quickly, and then partly maybe because he doesn't have this local backing anywhere in Ireland particularly strongly. But one of the things that McStephon had refused to allow happen was the bombing of England while he was in charge of the Provisional IRA. So when he's removed, within months then, the bombing campaign in England begins with the bombs at the Old Bailey. And then a year later, you have the bombs in Guildford, in Woolwich, and then most spectacularly and tragically in Birmingham. And then Birmingham, of course, a big Irish city, right? 3 of the 21 people killed there were second-generation Irish, and dozens of the 200 people injured were second-generation Irish. So the Troubles hit second-generation Irish people in all sorts of ways, including actually some who joined the British Army and had very weird experiences raiding Catholic homes here.
Yeah. So just to talk about the bombings, that's another thing that's probably glossed over is the second generation victims.
Yeah.
You know, is that a fair comment to say that that's sort of,
and also depending how you want to talk about victims, there were people who were actually injured by the bombs, and then you have Vince and Pat Maguire, second generation London Irish boys, who then were framed and spent years in prison when they were children because they were part of a family which was framed too. And their interrogations actually by the police are very interesting to read. Are you English or are you Irish? And their mum trying to protect them by saying, leave my teenage boy out of this, he's English. All of this confusion over identity comes up, in a much more serious way than like, which passport do you want?
There's one sort of aspect that you can't get away from in terms of second generation Irish, like the football.
So the rules changed in 1965. So the Republic of Ireland said that people who were second generation Irish basically could play for Ireland. Shea Brennan, who was a Man United player, was the first player in 1965, born in England, to play for Ireland. And then during the 70s and 80s then, sometimes the majority of players had been either English or Scottish born. In Italia 90, 16 of the 22 players representing Ireland had been born outside of the country. But there was always some tension, some level of tension around that. Are you really playing for Ireland because you're not good enough to play for England? Or have you only discovered your Irishness now because you want to play international football? Andy Townsend, I think Aldridge, I think hadn't been to Ireland before they came to make their debuts. But most spectacularly, really, this came to crunch when Roy Keane left the training camp in Saipan during the 2002 World Cup. So he and Mick McCarthy, second generation Irish guy who had been captain of Ireland and by then was manager of Ireland, and Keane, first generation from Cork, fight about all sorts of things, a level of professionalism, their attitudes towards the game, personality clash. And in the early reports of what happened, Keane says the unsayable, right? He calls McCarthy an English something, right? Shocking that the E word is used, because there's no going back from that. And in the days after that, everybody seems to agree, whether you're on Keane's side or McCarthy's side, that let's just say this didn't happen, right? So in subsequent accounts, you get the whole tirade without the English bit, because really that raises all sorts of questions for other players and supporters. Are we really accepted as Irish? Are you properly Irish? Are you only here out of convenience? But yeah, that goes back. Roy Keane, the young Cork guy, accusing a second generation colleague of not being properly Irish, goes back to Collins during the treaty debates, where he sees Markovic and De Valera and Childers, and he shouts at them, I won't take any of these arguments from you Americans, you foreigners, you English. This is the worst possible insult that you could say to a second generation Irish person, right?
So, Brian, the book was published by local publishers.
Beyond the Pale, Beyond the Pale.
It's out of print at the minute.
It's out of print now, although this is a bit technical and boring. The publishers have also folded. So I don't know how you want to say this, or if you want to say this. I have it and have rights to it. If anybody wants to post it on some educational website, go ahead. I don't know, you want to ask that or you want me to say that?
No, that's just if people want to get it, because I spent 2 days, it's in special collections, in the library. Yeah, and I spent 2 days reading it, and it's just fascinating. It really is. I really, really enjoyed it, and it's really accessible. It's if the flow of it is brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right.
Brian, thanks very much for coming
in. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks a lot.